Everyone, my name is Dr. Arash Rahmani and I'm an assistant professor of English. This is the second video in a series I have entitled Elements of Fiction, in which we talk about the most fundamental elements of fiction, including plot, characterization, point of view, themes, symbols, and things like that. If you haven't already watched the first video, I strongly urge you to stop this video, go and watch the first one in this series, and then come back and continue watching this second video, which deals with another significant component part of fiction, characters and the techniques that writers use in order to create likable and lifelike characters for us. Now, before we move forward, I just want to tell you, if you haven't already subscribed to my YouTube channel, please, I want you to just click on subscribe. And also, if you want to receive notifications as soon as we drop the next videos, I want you to click on the bell button next to the subscribe button so that you receive a notification, which allows you to be the first person to watch our next video. Now, let's talk about characters and characterization in literature. Well, as I'm sure you know, plot and character are completely inseparable in literature because, well, when we think about a work of fiction, we usually say that, okay, there are certain characters who are doing certain activities. That's the definition of plot and character, to put it in a nutshell. And so we need to understand the philosophy behind characters in literature and the techniques that most authors use in order to create a character who can be easily identified with on the part of the reader. But let's talk about different kinds of experiences that we, the readers, have when we approach a work of fiction. Now, we have two different kinds of readers when it comes to literature. We have readers who are serious in their pursuit of literary works. They usually look for something serious when they start reading a work of fiction. However, we also have certain readers who only want to pass the time. And so the only thing they want to do is just pick up a book, start reading it for pleasure, and not really care about the intricacies of the plot or what the work has to tell us about, for example, human nature. Now, the first group of readers, the serious readers, are really interested in characters. So these readers are less interested in the actions done by the characters than in those characters doing the actions. In other words, they are more interested in finding out the motivations that lie behind the actions done by the characters. And so the actions and the events themselves are not really important per se. They are only important as long as they tell us something about the human nature. They tell us something about the character in the work of fiction. Now, let's keep in mind that this exercise is extremely challenging. In other words, reading for fiction is way more challenging than reading for plot because characters are much more complex, they're variable, they're ambiguous. And so, the difference is that when somebody reads for plot, it's usually easy for that person to say what has happened. You know, recounting the events of the plot is usually an easy task, an easy undertaking, whereas it is usually difficult to say who a person really is. And the reason for this is because understanding human nature is difficult, right? Sometimes we have characters who cannot be easily labeled as good or bad. And so, if they ask you who that person really was, it sometimes proves to be quite challenging to express quite clearly who a person really is. And that's why reading for a character is more challenging, and that's why we say that serious readers of literature are the ones who are actually reading for character rather than reading for plot. So, Inexperienced readers, well, simply because they don't want to spend a lot of time on the work of fiction, they don't really want to, engage intellectually with the piece that they are reading, they usually demand characters who can be easily labeled as good or bad. So what they're doing is that they say, okay, give us characters whom we can recognize very easily. So that we can say, okay, well, this guy represents the forces of the good, and this guy represents the forces of evil, and well, they are in a conflict. They also want characters who are attractive, right? Why? Because for them, literature acts like a mirror. They want to see their own image reflected in the work, and that's why they demand attractive characters. Characters who are attractive enough that they can identify with. They can say, okay, well, I can see myself as that person, as that protagonist, okay? However, interpretive fiction or serious fiction doesn't include appealing characters all the time. But it doesn't reject appealing characters entirely either. What we have in serious fiction is an amalgamation of all these types of characters from a wide spectrum of personality and identity. So we might have one character who's purely evil or angelic, but we might also have certain characters who cannot be easily labeled because they seem to be like good people, but then something snapped and they turned really bad. So interpretive fiction does not reject appealing characters entirely. All it does is that it includes a greater variety of characters. Characters who cannot be easily labeled. Characters who might not be sympathetic. Characters with whom the readers might not be able to easily identify. And the reason why this kind of fiction does this is because the writers of serious fiction actually know that human nature is not always entirely black or white. All of us are gray. We have some dark sides, and we have some, angelic sides. And so we cannot really expect a work of fiction who's claiming to be serious to include only characters who are 100% evil or characters who are angelic. They haven't made any mistakes in their lives. They haven't done anything bad in their lives. Well, that's something which is not believable for readers. And serious readers do not want that. And interpretive writers do not want their characters to be like that because they want their characters to be a spitting image of real people who are gray, who have both good and bad sides. So that's what interpretive fiction actually gives us. Now, just to continue what we have been talking about so far, we can say that, well, fiction doesn't really have to have a hero or a villain all the time. We don't need to have a hero who is greater than life, just like the heroes that we had in epics. They were greater than life, they were brave people, they were saving the country. We don't have to have those kinds of characters in serious fiction. Sometimes the character of a piece of fiction might be an ordinary man with no bigger than life or greater than life qualities. We don't need a villain either, a pure villain, a person who's the pure embodiment of all evil qualities. We don't need to have that either in order to have a successful piece of story or a successful piece of fiction. Now, fiction is valuable for us, especially this kind of fiction which which provides us with an opportunity to study human nature. That kind of fiction is valuable for us because it offers us an unparalleled opportunity to observe human nature in all its glory, in all its complexity and multiplicity. It enables us to know people, to understand them, and to learn compassion for them, because otherwise we might not be able to do that in real life. Let me ask you a question. How often do you come across a situation when you see people in a very, very serious situation in which they have to make a serious decision, a life and death decision? Let's be honest, quite rarely, because we are usually spending time with our relatives, and so it's not often that we get to see them or to see like other people in a very, very consequential situation when they have to make a really important decision. How often do you find the opportunity to observe people when they are living in their own private homes? How often do you get the opportunity to observe their inner thoughts, their private lives? Rarely, if not never. So, the reason why fiction is so important for us is that we can know fictional characters more deeply than we know real people. Because whenever you pick up a novel, a short story, you are actually reading about a character who is in a significant situation and he has to make some serious decisions. That is something that rarely happens in the real world. Writers also provide us with a window through which we can look at the inner lives and thoughts and feelings of the characters. Again, something which is quite improbable, if not impossible, in the real world. Because especially when it comes to people who do not feel like sharing their feelings and thoughts. So in real life, sometimes it's impossible for us to know what somebody thinks, how somebody feels. But in fiction, it's something that happens quite regularly. And so that's why we like fiction, because it gives us the opportunity to study people. And so, in return, knowing fictional characters well, knowing the techniques to know fictional characters, helps us know real people better. If you have the necessary tools to study fictional characters, and if you practice really hard, if you practice getting to know people frequently, fictional characters frequently, then you can get to know real people also well, because you have experience. Think of it as this, for example, this scientist who's working in a lab and he's working with some, lab rat. Well, this scientist has the opportunity to put these lab rats in, for example, a maze and then study their behavior. A writer is like that scientist. He puts human beings in a maze and he watches them act and react. And then he reports on that. He reports on that experiments, and he gives us this opportunity to watch that experiment even though we were not present in the lab. But we get the report. And that's what makes fiction so valuable for us. Now, the technique that writers use in order to create characters for us in fiction is called characterization. So characterization is the act of creating and describing characters in literature. It can include different things. Characterization might include the description of the physical attributes of a character. But we can also, on some occasions, we might also be given an opportunity to study the character's personality. We might be given an analysis of his thoughts, of his feelings. So all of this is what we call characterization. A writer needs to have a special characterization technique so that he can tell us, the readers, who that character is, how he feels, what he has done, and why he has done what he has done. So the way the characters act, think, and speak can also be a part of the characterization technique. Now, we have another important issue when we discuss characters in literature, and that is character presentation. how do writers present their characters to us, the readers? There are two very important techniques that writers can use in order to present us their characters. The first character is called the telling technique. Well, obviously the name is self-explanatory. In the telling technique, the writer or the narrator in the piece tells us directly what kind of character that person is via exposition and analysis. In other words, if he wants us to know that somebody is generous, he tells us that he is generous. So he says, okay, so Jeannie in this novel was a generous woman. Jeannie was, for example, a person who was generous. One of the most important qualities which defined Jeannie was her generosity. So the writer, the author, through the narrator, tells us the qualities that define a certain character. That is called the telling technique. But that's not something good. And by good, I mean it's not something convincing. Imagine a scenario in which somebody tells you, in real life, in your own life, somebody tells you, okay, have you known like George for long? You say, no, I haven't known him for long, but I just know that he's a great man. And then the other person says, how do you know he's great? Because you say that because Jack said he's great. You expect the other person to believe you, but let's be honest, what you just said is not emotionally convincing. If you tell me that, I say, okay, well, I have to see it for myself, right? I have to see it for myself. I have to see it with my own eyes so that I believe that George is a great man. So when you tell somebody about someone else, yeah, it is clear, it is direct, it's economical, but it is not emotionally convincing. And that's why we have a different technique. And that different technique is the showing technique. When writers show us characters in action. So a good example is, for example, this Japanese Quince by Galsworthy. In that story, which is a very, very brief short story, the writer or the narrator doesn't really tell us about the fact that the protagonist of the story is stuck in a routine. And so his life has become mundane and dull. He doesn't use these words. All he tells us is that, well, the character woke up as usual at 7. He started his breakfast. He did this, he did that. As usual, he went on his morning walk. And so, through the showing technique, he tells us that the protagonist of the story is a person who's doing his routine, and so his life has become, colorless. There is not much going on in his life. And we prefer this showing technique when the characters show us, when the writers show us the characters in action. We prefer this because why? Because stories need to be dramatized. Because we need to see them do something so that we believe that, yeah. So imagine about, the generosity of Jeannie that we talked about before. So instead of telling you that Jeannie was a generous character, the writer or the narrator tells you, okay, well, it was the end of the month and Jeannie had already received her salary. The first thing she did was to visit the orphanage and buy food for, the kids there. And the second thing that Jeannie did was to log on to a charity's website and donate $100. When the character is shown to us in this way and we see him or her performing certain actions which remind us of a quality, of a trait, of a characteristic, then we can say, okay, yeah, this is emotionally convincing. So if we are really to believe in the selfishness, in the generosity of the character, we must see that character act selfishly or act generously, right? That is the showing technique. Let's talk about some examples. What is the direct presentation? What is the telling technique when we want to say that somebody is cruel? Well, it's easy. Jane is a cruel person, she said. That is the telling technique. But let's talk about the showing technique. As Jane walked past the box labeled free puppies, she secretly glanced around her and then gave a box a swift kick. How do you interpret this second sentence? It was a box of free puppies. Who doesn't like puppies? And then this Jane here looked around just to make sure nobody was watching and then kicked the puppies. Jane is a cruel person. The second sentence is so convincing emotionally that after reading this sentence, you hate Jane for kicking the puppies. But what about the first person? Jane is a cruel person. Okay, how can I be certain? Why do you expect me to believe you? Show me something, right? That is the difference between direct presentation and indirect presentation. The telling technique and the showing technique. Some more examples from Jane Austen, right? A good-looking and gentleman-like person. He had a pleasant countenance, easy, unaffected manners. All of this is the telling technique. Let's take a look at another example from East of Eden by John Steinbeck. Now, Steinbeck describes Kathy, one of the characters of the novel, by using the telling technique in most situations. However, in one specific situation, when Steinbeck wants to tell us that she was a really, really evil character, what he writes is one of the best examples of the showing technique. Let's read the excerpt. Kathy was chewing a piece of meat, chewing with her front teeth. Samuel had never seen anyone chew that way before, and when she had swallowed, her little tongue flicked through her lips like a serpent, right? So Samuel's mind repeated, something, can't find what it is, something wrong, and the silence hung on the table. Just imagine in your mind's eye the way that Kathy is being described here. Now Steinbeck wants to say that Kathy was a truly, truly evil character. But in this case, he opts for a more chilling image. Kathy seems to eat meat much like a snake would. And then this indirect characterization forces the reader to understand this passage as an allusion to the serpent in the Garden of Eden, right? And thereby, as readers, we can infer Kathy's sinfulness. Just imagine the part in which Steinbeck describes the little tongue coming out of the mouth of Kathy. Serpents do that. Snakes do that. And so through the showing technique, through indirect presentation of character, Steinbeck convinces us that Kathy was actually an evil character, just like the serpent in the story of Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden. So these are the two techniques that writers usually use in order to present us with a character in the story. Okay. Sorry about that. So we have some basic principles of characterization as well. In other words, if a writer wishes his or her characters to be accepted by the readers, he must follow certain principles. To be convincing, characters in literature must have a few qualities. First, they must have consistent behavior. They must be consistent in their behavior. They must behave consistently unless there is a justifiable cause or reason for the change. Unless they undergo a life-changing, for example, they undergo a life-changing experience and then they come out of that experience a completely different man or woman. If that doesn't happen, well, we expect consistency. To be convincing, characters must also be motivated in their actions. You know, we cannot accept a character who is not motivated in his or her actions, because we might ask, okay, why is he doing this? Why is he like killing people? What's the reason? What's the motivation behind it? If you remember at the beginning of this presentation, I told you that serious readers usually look for the motivations that lie behind a character's actions. And that is why. Because to be convincing, characters should have some reason for their actions. They should also be plausible, right? And so they should be somehow lifelike. We don't expect extreme characters on the extreme ends of the spectrum. Purely evil with no good qualities. Purely angelic with no bad qualities. We cannot accept characters like that, especially in serious fiction. And so they should be plausible. They should be lifelike. They should actually represent characters that we might encounter in real life. You might now ask me, okay, what about like fantasy? You know, in fantasy, we have characters who are like supernatural creatures. What about, for example, like Gothic fiction, when we have supernatural forces? Even if you are dealing with fantasy, even if you're dealing with elves, with characters who might not exist in the real world, we accept them as long as they tell us something about the human nature. And so when we say plausible and lifelike, we mean they should be able to teach us something new about the human nature, even if they are supernatural creatures. Another important element in discussing characters in literature is the fact that characters usually develop, right? They usually grow. In short stories or in novels, they usually grow, they usually change. Let's talk about this. You know, based on their developments, characters can be divided into two categories. First, flat characters. Flat characters are usually one-dimensional. We can easily define them by making references to one or two traits. And so, when characters are not really complex, we call them flat. A good example is, for example, somebody like Tom Buchanan in The Great Gatsby. He's a one-dimensional, he's a flat character, because we can define him with just one or two qualities. He's an arrogant man, and he only cares about money. People who can be defined with only one characteristic feature are called flat characters. Round characters, on the other hand, are complex. They are multidimensional. They cannot be described in a single sentence saying that, okay, this character is the embodiment of evil. This character is a symbol for, being stingy or a stingy person. So round characters are complex, they are multidimensional. But it's important to keep in mind that regardless of flatness or roundness, usually in short stories, minor characters or characters who do not really play an important role in the story are usually flat, and that's okay. We don't have any problem with that. However, major characters need to be round, because we are reading fiction to understand the complexity of human nature, okay? And so, again, regardless of flatness or roundness, all characters must be characterized fully enough so that we, the readers, can justify their role as well as their presence in the work. So they have to be characterized fully, regardless of their roundness or their flatness. There should be enough characterization that we can actually justify their presence in the story. A subcategory, let's talk about flat characters, because, well, usually in novels we have a couple of important characters who are round, but the rest of them are usually flat. A subcategory of flat characters in literature is called stock characters. Stock characters are usually stereotypical characters who are repeatedly used in literature of all ages. Like, for example, the eccentric detective Sherlock Holmes, or for example, Auguste Dupin in the works of Edgar Allan Poe. Those are examples of eccentric detectives who are stereotypical or stock characters. The cruel stepmother in fairy tales and in fiction. That's also another example of stock characters. Now, we are not saying that we should never use, or writers should never use stock characters. No, great writers actually make stock characters memorable by adding a few idiosyncrasies which make them stand out. So if you're a writer and you want to use a stock character, it's always a great idea to add a few idiosyncrasies, a few unique character traits to make that character, that stock character, memorable for the readers. Now, we talked about the development of characters, and we said that, based on their developments, we can categorize them into flat and round characters. But there's also another classification. Characters in literature can be either static or developing or dynamic. A static character is usually a character who does not change at all. So he or she is the same person at the end of the story as he or she was at the beginning of the story. No change. Developing characters, on the other hand, dynamic characters are, on the other hand, undergo a permanent change. Now, this change could be for better or for worse, but it is a permanent change, a kind of change that transforms the perspective and the outlook of that person forever. It is usually a change that redefines the character, right? So, if you really want to create a developing character, you should actually, so it's not just a simple change in opinion. It's not a minor change in opinion to say that, okay, he believed that chocolate was not delicious, but at the end of the story, he came to this realization that chocolate is really delicious. That's a minor change in opinion, okay? Real dynamic characters experience a more serious change than just a minor change in opinion. So, for example, Cinderella is still a static character, even though she rises from like a normal girl to a princess, because the change that happens does not really redefine Cinderella. But Dick Prosser in the story Child by Tiger, is an extremely dynamic character because he changes from a gentle character at the beginning of the story who was amazingly tender, who was deeply religious, who tells all those like white boys for whom he's working, hey, you gotta like and you gotta love each other like brothers, into a crazy person who goes on a killing spree, killing so many different people. That is a huge change. And then if you read between the lines, you see about the racial tensions in this story. And you understand, oh, that is why Dick Prosser changed, right? And so dynamic change has to be something extremely significant, and there should also be a good reason for it. In that case, the racial tensions in the story. Okay, so let's talk about this idea of change in characters. Now, in short stories, change usually happens to only one character. Mostly because the short story writers usually have limited space. And so they cannot really talk about the change in all of the characters, right? So in short stories, there's only room for only one person to change. And that person is usually the protagonist of the story. And the protagonist of the story usually changes in a crucial section or part of the story. And that change defines the meaning and the significance of the whole story. So when you find that change, you understand the meaning and the significance of the whole story. Let's talk about the qualities of a convincing change. What qualities should a change possess so that we can say, okay, yeah, the change was convincing for me? First, it should be within the possibilities of the character who undergoes it. So the character should have the possibility of that change. It shouldn't be something that is not within the realm of possibility for that specific character. It should be a convincing change must be sufficiently motivated by the circumstances in which the character finds himself or herself. So the circumstances should also dictate that change. If the situation does not really require or demand any change, well then that change is not really convincing. And the final quality of a convincing change is that the writer should allow sufficient time for the change to occur. It shouldn't be an overnight change. We should allow the character, we should give him enough time to experience that change and to become a completely different person. Okay, now I think this is the end of our presentation for today. If you want to see this idea of character and change in practice, this is the story that I want you to do as homework. If you really want to understand how characters are presented to us and how, for example, certain actions change the characters, then The Kiss by Anton Chekhov is the perfect example. So please read that. If you have already read that story, please go to the comments and tell me about the characters in that work. And if you haven't read it, please, I want you to go and read that story. But don't forget this video. Please come back and leave a comment in the comment section and tell me how Anton Chekhov presents us the character of the soldier in The Kiss. What happens to the soldier? How does that event, that seemingly insignificant event, change the character for us? Is the change convincing? So please, if you have read the story, please leave a comment and tell me your opinion about this story from the perspective of what we have been talking about, okay? So that's it. Thank you very much for watching the video. Please, if you haven't already subscribed to my YouTube channel, please subscribe right now. Also click on the bell button to receive notifications as soon as I drop the next video. And please share my videos with your friends. If you know a person